Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're listening from. Thanks for joining us. It's Friday, and you know what that means? It's another day for another fabulous She Rocks. I love ending my way this week with all of you and introducing yet another amazing woman who works in digital or digital adjacent fields. If you've not met me before, if you've not tuned in before, my name is Amy Vaughn, and I am the CEO of this amazing organization of women supporting women from across the country in all things digital and in life. And so I'm super excited to have you all here today. I'm going to introduce our guest here in just a moment. By the way, we are streaming on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So let us know whatever channels you're listening from. Let us know what city you're listening from. We love seeing where everybody's at. We want you to be active in the chat. The cool thing is that we'll be able to see all your aggregate comments in the comment section here, in the StreamYard that we're using. So don't be shy. Drop questions, drop comments. Let us know if you're interested in what we're sharing. We've got a really great conversation here for you today. If you're not a member, be sure to check out our website, togetherindigital.com. We have got an amazing promotion going on right now. We are celebrating our 5-year founding. So it's so hard to believe the years have gone by so fast, but then at the same time, our lives, so many of our members' lives have changed so much since the beginning of those 5 years. It kind of also feels like a lifetime. Throw in 2020, and it feels like 2 lifetimes. But right now we're offering $140 off our annual membership. This is our founding rate that our members got when we were just starting out in year 1 and 2. So this is not likely to happen again. If you're not a member, check it out, sign up. We are, like I said, a national group of women who work in digital and digital adjacent fields from across the country. We support and uplift one another and empower one another through asking for what we need without any sense of guilt or shame, and giving without any sense of judgment. Every single day, I get to watch all of our members come together despite the pandemic, despite the barriers between us right now, and have very productive conversations that can be not just career changing, but also life changing. So be sure to check that out. We also have an upcoming virtual summit. If I can remember how to click on things and queue up my stuff, our Power Moves virtual summit is happening March 25th. That's going to be a day, a half a day, chock full of some amazing women-ex who are going to be sharing some of their stories, their experiences. Some really great speakers we have lined up about how women have been impacted specifically by the pandemic in our lives at home and at work. As well as a panel on getting what you want, talking about negotiation, and then also working through imposter syndrome, or something that we like to call imposter syndrome. I just read this headline the other day that somebody said it's like a myth. I like that. I want to dig into that more. But we're going to talk about imposter syndrome in the job search, because so many women are out of work right now and looking for jobs, and that's a very taxing thing. So we have a lot of great things going on. Be sure to check out the website to kind of refresh all of that, because I want to just hustle up and get to our amazing guest, Audre Lorde. Audre, thank you for joining us today. I'm so glad to have you here.
Hi, Amy. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to your community as well. Hi, everyone. There's so many amazing women that I know that are in your community. And so if you are here today, hi. And if I've never met you, I'm going to share a little bit more about what I do. My name is Aparna, and I'm the founder and principal of a data-driven DEI consultancy. We focus on evidence-based and data-informed practices for shifting organizational culture, policies, and practices. And it sounds like exactly that unsexy. My day job is really, really kind of, I don't know, nerdy. My day is filled with staring at spreadsheets, at Tableau, and making sense of all of its leaders. Amy, if you can give me my slides, that would be great.
Yeah, definitely. And by the way, don't worry, we love nerdy. The more data, the better. You're in the right place to be nerdy. Don't worry about it.
Thank you. So I'm gonna skip to this bit. I want to start the day with land acknowledgement for so many reasons. Streaming in from Seattle, I'm sitting on unceded Duwamish and Coast Salish lands. And something that like really strikes me and I think about all the time is that only 150 years ago, Seattle and our surrounding areas were primarily occupied by Native Americans. And now our city is so white, and you know, we've pushed people off to reservations. And so if you are curious about the native tribes that occupied where you now live or where you grew up, my absolute favorite resource is this website called nativeland.ca. And it's brilliant for like getting more information about who lived where you now live or where you grew up. For a lot of the folks in the Midwest, and I grew up, I went to high school in the Midwest as well. The names of our towns are often like named after native tribes, and we don't even know it. So let's get on to the meat of our conversation. Conscious inclusion. Why conscious inclusion as a leadership trait? Because when I think about it, without consciously choosing to include people, we often unconsciously exclude them. For folks that are dialing in today that are relatively new to diversity, equity, and inclusion, I often use kind of like food analogies. It's also because I love eating. It's probably my only hobby at this point in the pandemic. So let's say you grew up in the Midwest or in a culture where your diet is primarily meat and potatoes. It takes conscious effort to shop for and prep to eat more veggies. Or some of you might be single people. I used to be a single person until pretty recently. And sometimes at the end of a workday, what do? We like grab a bowl of cereal or we make some oatmeal, pour ourselves a glass of wine and call it a day, right? So without conscious inclusion, it's really, really easy to lean into our default settings. And for me, it's popcorn, apple, and like a beer. It's not a healthy diet that I want to promote today. Thank you, Juliana. Same food. Yeah. So before I talk more about tips on how to be a more inclusive leader, I do want to ground us in a little bit of American history. It's become a bit controversial to talk about facts in some places and with some people, and I'm not going to say who, but we all know who they are. And recently, one of my favorite resources, which is the 1619 Project by the New York Times, is being banned by public schools, primarily in what used to be the slave states in the United States. So all of that's an act of conscious exclusion. And we're actually familiar with what conscious exclusion looks like. I brought this graphic. I promise this talk is going to get more inspirational and uplifting. But for now, here you are staring at a little bit of American history. We know what conscious exclusion looks like because we've excluded people through legislation, whether that is, you know, the American institution of slavery, or it's the Chinese Exclusion Act, or it's the internment of Japanese Americans, or it's the fact that in the United States, the Federal Housing Administration legally excluded Black homeowners from having access to really affordable home loans. Or it was only in 1965 that, you know, for instance, we passed this landmark Immigration Act, which has made it possible for families like mine and possibly families like yours to immigrate to the United States and to have access to education and opportunities and often high-paying jobs or an entree into entrepreneurship, right? And when I think about that sort of year or date, 1965, that was pretty recent. Many of our parents were alive then and were witness to these laws changing. And many of your grandparents were likely protesting the desegregation of schools, workplaces, and communities. It was so, so recent. And we forget how recent it is because when we look at, you know, pictures of Martin Luther King or some of the other civil rights leaders, they're in black and white. And I found out just a couple of years ago that the media decided to publish photos in black and white because it made it seem like the thing happened a lot longer ago than the reality, right? And the reality is we had color television and color film in 1965. But now we operate in the domain of unconscious inclusion. And in the next 20 years or so, without conscious inclusion, we're going to run into some problems, in part because the majority of people in the United States by, I think it's predicted 2042, are going to be primarily people of color. And how we work with people that are different from us will have a significant impact not only on our economy and our community, but our everyday life. Deloitte has sort of these 6 traits of inclusive leaders. Specifically, these traits are to help leaders succeed in an increasingly ever-changing world, and a diverse world. And when I talk about diversity, I'm not simply talking about race, although race is really important and a very important dynamic in the United States specifically. But when I talk about diversity, I'm talking about gender, I'm talking about immigrants and first-gen folks, I'm talking about people of all ethnicities and backgrounds, people with disabilities, all kinds of people that we sort of tuck away and have out of sort of our line of vision. In particular, in these leadership traits, I want to draw your attention to cognizance and cultural intelligence. Leaders, many of you have job titles that are leadership titles. Many of you are startup founders. Regardless of whether you have the title or not, it's so important for leaders to ask themselves consistently about how they show up with people that are different from them, either because of their work experiences or lived experiences. Because these questions help ensure that they're not unconsciously erasing core and interrelated parts of someone's identity. And right, it's gonna be super important because the world is changing. And one of the ways in which this shows up in real life is today, if you ask women of color, the majority of them are going to say, I feel like I have to downplay some aspect of my race, my ethnicity, or my culture in order to succeed. And that has some really big consequences. So I know that as women, we've definitely been following along this past year in all of the ways in which COVID is affecting our lives, right? It's not lost to any of us, the heavy lift of taking care of kids and homeschooling, and maybe we have elderly parents. I have a mom that I spend my weekends with, and that's really important, and it takes a lot of time. But this is the reality. At the end of 2019, which feels like a million years ago, but really it was only 14 months ago, at the end of 2019, we saw some of the biggest gains for women of color. And most of those gains were of their own making. In 2019, we minted more women of color as entrepreneurs, as business owners, some slow growth in the corner office and in the C-suite. But overall, the demographic shift really translated into the workplace. And for the very first time, the majority of new hires were not only people of color, but they were specifically women of color. But without intentionality in the workplace, without inclusion in the workplace, we lost all of those gains in just 1 year. We closed last year, which also feels like a million years ago, but it was like 6 weeks ago. We closed last year with some of the biggest job losses for women, specifically Black and Latina women. I think a lot about how organizations have been sort of spinning their wheels for the last 2 or 3 decades, talking about the business case for diversity and inclusion, implementing programs, initiatives. All of us on this call are guilty of buying lots of books. I know that I have been buying more books than ever on these topics in the last 6 months. But I don't know if I should tell you how many I've actually read. Part of the challenge of D&I is when we talk about inclusion and belonging, what we're actually doing is integration. I know I have, and I'm sure you have, seen all of the super viral Instagram posts urging each other to push past definitions of leadership that would make assertive women bad, right? It's like hashtag it's okay to be bossy. But when it comes to inclusion of people that are different from us, especially when it comes to race and culture, we don't actually hold that standard. We invite people to the table so long as they kind of conform to our expectations, so long as they aren't too bossy, too aggressive, too angry, or pushing too much of an agenda that makes us uncomfortable. So, because I do this all day, every day, talking with leaders, I came up with a little graphic. It's not sexy, just like my work. So this is my bell curve. This is my bell curve of allyship. It's not scientifically proven, so take it for what it's worth. On one end, we have people that are in active opposition of any aspect of DEI, and we know exactly what these people look like. They're the people that stormed the Capitol last month. They're the people who's like the boss that doesn't make accommodations for working parents who have caregiving responsibilities. And each one of us could really come up with dozens of examples of what active opposition looks like. Most of us, we also know what passive opposition looks like. It looks like people who stand by while harm is being done. They don't have any skin in the game and they're happy to let the harm happen. Those people are problematic as well. We know them. Then we have the majority of the population that's neutral. They're indifferent because it doesn't impact their life. But the category of people that I am often most concerned with and the people that I want to shift are the people that are passive supporters. They're the ones that are on social media advocating for Black lives. They are the ones that like don't want to see kids in cages. But when there's an opportunity that happens in real life with their families, with their friends, with the parents in their child's school, the PTA, their colleagues, they don't do anything at all. Many of us are in that category. We often default to that category because it's really hard. It's actually really hard to take action when our jobs and our relationships are on the line. So I brought you 5 things. These are things that I do, and these are things that I've seen work really well with lots of folks. The first one is impact versus intention. And what impact versus intention means is no matter the intent of your actions or your words, if the impact is that it's icky and it's caused harm, then the best thing to do is to show up with a little bit of humility and acknowledge the impact. One of the really bizarre things about unconscious bias that doesn't get talked about is when we judge others, we judge them on the basis of their words, their actions, and the consequences of those things. But when we judge ourselves based on our intentions. So we give ourselves a free pass. And when we look at others, we're like, man, she is eating like oatmeal and a glass of wine for dinner again. Like that's not okay. But like here we are like eating our popcorn and a beer, which is like basically same, it's alcohol and carbs. And it's 100% carbs at the end of the day. The second is believe BIPOC. BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. And it's important to make the distinction here because the experiences of Black and Indigenous people is so very different than that of other people of color in the United States. And so you might say to yourself, well, I have not had that bad experience with this manager. So I'm inclined to not believe when a person of color says that they've had a different experience. My advice to everybody is, I know that that default setting feels really good, but just go ahead and believe the other person. It's actually the same as when a woman says, I've been harassed by X, Y, and Z. Instead of saying, oh, but I've never been harassed by X, Y, and Z. No, that's no longer in vogue. What is more acceptable now is to say, yeah, I hear you. Like, I believe that you've been harassed or assaulted or mistreated. So the same applies for BIPOC. The third is not my love for the New Yorker cartoons, but this tip, which is like no more hippos. And hippo stands for the highest paid person in the room. Often we defer to the opinion of the highest paid person in the room, even when they're the farthest removed from the ground realities and are least likely to have a diverse group of friends, especially in the United States. One of the facts that I read many years ago is that 3 out of 4 white Americans have no friends of color. And it struck me as being really odd because there's no aspect of my life where I can actually avoid white folks as a person of color. Um, and when we move up in leadership ranks in our own organizations and as, you know, leaders of larger organizations, you will notice that it's pretty segregated racially, ethnically, gender-wise. So to the extent possible, we got to do away with listening to the opinion of the highest paid person in the room. My fourth tip is giving and receiving feedback with grace. Too often, our impression and reaction of others is predicated more on who we are and how we see others than who the other person actually is or what they're saying. And often, when somebody gives us feedback and we don't regard that person highly, we sort of kick into our default settings. Sometimes we are defensive. Back in the day, when we were in offices, we would take the longer way to the bathroom to avoid their office, to avoid them entirely. We may not include them by mistake, of course, into our brunch club or some networking opportunity. We may start to mistrust the person who's giving us feedback, right? And sometimes we sort of smile and say thank you, but in reality, we're doing all kinds of like nasty, mean things in the background. Instead, and it's so hard to do, and it's even harder to catch yourself when you're doing some of these kind of yucky things, is to say, you know what, I'm going to thank the person who's giving me the feedback because, oh my gosh, they are taking such a risk to be vulnerable with me and they're making time to share with me. And so I know that I will experience the most amount of growth when I actually give a damn about both the person and about their feedback, right? And my last tip, and it's my favorite one, it's also free, it doesn't cost you anything, is practicing humility. Let's just normalize apologizing when we've done something or we've behaved in ways that are exclusionary. It's okay. It's hard. D&I is not easy. It's not easy to integrate those principles. And sometimes we sort of screw up, and that's totally human. It's totally normal. But just like when we maybe screw up with our partner, we like the next day kind of, you know, maybe go with a glass of wine, or we make them their favorite meal and we say, hey, I'm sorry, I did this thing that didn't sit with you. We can do the same things with our friends, with our community, with our colleagues, with that parent in the PTA that like really triggers us. And I'm giving all of these examples about PTAs, even though I have no kids at all. And I'm not part of a PTA. So you may take that advice with a grain of salt.
Spot on.
I do have a lot of mommy friends, and I get to be a fly on the wall often when they're talking about their issues. So I'm going to sort of wrap up now and share with you my favorite quote from Stacey Abrams. I know she's a hero to so many of us. And she says, going backwards isn't an option and standing still isn't enough. So we got to move forward. And every day it literally is putting one foot in front of the other and making decisions that are slightly different than the ones we made the day before. To that end, we're doing two things in my company that are free and open to others as well. One of the things that we're doing is launching a rather large workplace study at the intersection of diversity and inclusion, psychological well-being, safety, and engagement, because the research base is honestly pretty lame. That's not a scientific term. And it's mostly focused on Fortune 500 companies, and most of us don't work there. In fact, the majority of the country does not work in a Fortune 500 company. We are entrepreneurs, we're startup founders, we work at small and mid-sized businesses. Maybe we work in philanthropy or nonprofits or government. And the research needs to reflect our experiences. So if you're interested in taking part in the study, you're welcome to sign up for it. We're going to send out a couple of surveys over the next few months. And if you're interested in getting your team involved, again, it doesn't cost anything. We will send out free profiles, team profiles, to any team that wants to participate, so you have data to make better decisions. And another resource that we have is kind of a learning journey quiz, because I came into my teen years during like the peak of the Cosmo magazine quizzes. Remember, it's like, you know, like, does your boyfriend love you? Like, you take 10 questions and then you find out. It's not scientific, and our quiz is also not, but it'll give you some ideas on what to read. It'll give you some ideas on podcasts that may not be on your radar. And along the way, we'll, you know, slowly drip some content that's relevant for where you are in your journey. So with that, I'm gonna thank you all for listening in and tuning into my radio station, and Amy will tell us what's next.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we will wait for some questions to come in. I definitely have some as well. I did pop the website up onto the screen. It's also in the chat for you all. I've taken the quiz. It's really fast. It's really quick. And the follow-up is really wonderful, because like you said, the content that's being kind of shared with you is relevant to where you are in your experience. So it's the kind of material you might be ready to read, because I think a lot of us who have been going through this allyship journey, we realize, you know, there's a lot of discomfort to sit in. And if you're uncomfortable, that's good. That means you're learning something. That means you're growing, but that doesn't make it easy. And I have found, as a highly sensitive person as well, that it's better for me to kind of take like little steps in things before I kind of just throw myself whole hog in, because then it gets dark and gets bad from there. But I was kind of curious, you know, when you were sharing and we were talking about the statistics for women in job loss and women at home, I'm just kind of curious, like, what is, based on how, like, the trajectory of how things were going in 2019 and then 2020 happened. I mean, I'm sure it's probably more about your frame of mind, but how do you feel about, like, where that has placed women's equality? Have we gone backwards? Is it gonna push us forward? What do you think?
Well, I leave the thinking to people who have a lot more intelligence and expertise than I do. And so we know, and, you know, like the World Economic Forum, you know, has now pushed out gender parity by another dozen years. I mean, it was already at something like 212 years, which is many generations. Like, that's definitely not within our lifetime. Unless there's some like super sci-fi discovery that's happened that I'm not aware of. And they've pushed it even farther out. So, and we're just talking about gender. We're not even talking intersectionally about race. But yeah, I mean, but from my vantage point, you know, yeah, like so much of the gains are gone. And it's going to take a really long time. And if, you know, there are folks on this call, and I actually probably even you, Amy, like, I think we're all kind of in the same age group where we're coming out of college or graduate school in the middle of those recession years. And what happened with the last recession is companies were offering really skilled labor, $20 an hour. right?
Yeah.
And so those of us that came out of college at that time, it's taken some real effort to like, you know, start to see gains in our own salaries because we started, I mean, my first job with 3 degrees in 2009 was $33,000 a year. You know, so what reason does an employer have to pay me any more year on year when that's where I started? And we're experiencing that. I mean, I also had the front row seat to watching leaders and employers make decisions and who they cut early in the pandemic were their frontline workers. And those jobs are primarily communities of color.
Yep.
And they're the ones that, I don't know, like, when do they come back?
Right.
You know, when I have like a full service experience at Nordstrom.
Right.
Like, right? Like, I'm not going to a makeup counter in the middle of a pandemic, right? And yeah, so
yeah. Awesome. Or not awesome. But the other thing, I love your steps, because I think that's another thing, like you and I were discussing before the call, before this today, is that, you know, in your journey, there's so much education that has to happen. But then at some point you have to step out of just the learning. I mean, always be learning, always be listening, because there's always more to listen and learn. But at some point there needs to be some action. And I know that, you know, a lot of people probably on the call today have seen or have heard certain instances where maybe they're at work that they have seen somebody being marginalized or left out of a conversation or not considered, just no equity whatsoever. So if somebody hears or sees something that they feels improper, how do they bring it up? Who do they go to? This is a big, I love this question because we get asks. We don't get this exact ask, but I know y'all that want to know something like this because you've seen it and you've heard it. Either it's the uncomfortable laugh or you go talk to some other friend about it. What do we actually do in that instance?
Yeah, I mean, the best thing to do is to call it out when it happens, you know, and we've talked about like tips like amplification in sort of like largely, you know, environments where women are few. One of the tips is if somebody kind of attributes the really good idea to a person who didn't share it, you say, hey, actually, Brian, Amy is the one that, you know, shared this idea and I want to make sure that she gets the credit for it, right? So we've seen this technique all the time, right? And so I think you can extend that to people of color as well. You can say, hey, I actually heard Aparna, you know, had shared this idea in our last meeting, so I want to make sure that she gets the credit. Now, when super egregious things happen, depending on like the hierarchy of the organization and your position, right, in the organization, if you have power, then the most appropriate thing to do is to say like, those comments are not appreciated in my meeting.
Yeah.
You know, or like, if you're going to be in my meeting, one of the rules is that like you leave this at the door. Often we don't have that power, or we're really afraid of the consequences of saying that. So this is where I think like visible allies, visible co-conspirators are really helpful. So if something shitty just went down in a meeting, then I can go to my co-conspirator and say, hey, Amy, it would really help if you rose this with the VP.
Yeah.
Because I know that you have clout. Also, you have nothing to lose. And doing that, the worst thing to do is to gossip about it. The worst thing to do is to go to the person who was aggressed and say, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you, right? Because there's no solution in that. Like, you're being sorry doesn't help that person. And so taking charge and making sure it doesn't happen again is the way to go. I have colleagues in like philanthropy, impact investing, finance, that'll often say, if you're not fighting for equity so hard that you risk losing your job, then you're not doing enough.
Yeah. It's an awkward place to be, I think, for some people, but I think it's one of those things. I know for me, it was probably, I went to the 3% conference back in 2011, 2012, whichever the first year it was. And it was so eye-opening because it's just these conversations just weren't being had in the work environment. And so like, once you kind of are awake to those microaggressions, against other genders, people of color, things like that, it's so much easier to notice it. And I actually want to go back for a second, because I think you referenced a really good tool of radical candor. Again, to add to the number of books that maybe you don't always read. This is a short one, but it's really, really great, by Kim Scott. And I love your chart that you shared. I think if you struggle to really speak up and have a voice, if you are again, almost everybody who knows me knows I'm an Enneagram nerd right now. And I'm a 9. I'm a 9. So having my opinion shared is hard. I will stand up and fight for anybody else. I've been standing up for other kids that got bullied since I was little on the playground, but standing up for myself sometimes is very, very hard. And then depending on who I'm having to approach, I hate conflict. So radical candor, at least for me, was just an amazing tool to really help me show. I think Brene Brown has a quote too that's similar, is that clear is kind. If I can associate the fact that what I'm trying to do, although confrontational, and although it makes me start sweating, having to confront somebody with something that they have made an affront to someone and they're not even conscious about it. Every time I've ever stepped into that, I've never, ever, ever, ever regretted it, y'all. Never. And I've done it to my boss. I've done it to my boss's boss in big companies and small companies, and I have never regretted it. So I encourage you all to check out the book. I think a lot of the tips that you shared too also were really, really helpful and insightful. But that book as well was super helpful in kind of getting someone like me to pluck up the courage to even more so see what's going on around me and learn how to speak up and use my voice. So definitely use yours.
Yeah.
We did have a question. In nonprofits, what are your thoughts on providing compensation for those who share their beneficiary impact stories?
Yeah, my tip for nonprofits broadly is pay your people market rates. Just freaking pay people. One of the conversations that I end up having with white leaders specifically, especially the ones whose partners work in high tech or in other super high paying jobs, right? And so they have almost the luxury and the privilege of working in nonprofits. Yeah, I mean, one of the conversations I have with them is passion for something is not an excuse for not compensating.
Right.
Because passion doesn't pay my rent.
Nope.
Passion doesn't put food on the table. Passion doesn't manifest itself into my retirement account. And so if where you lean into is, great, you're super passionate, so you should feel good about making $17 an hour.
Yeah.
Quit it. Just quit it. If you're a leader in nonprofit and you are putting out job descriptions, put your salary up front and center. I've heard if I had $1 for every time I heard this, I would actually be a very wealthy woman right now. People will say, well, if I put the salary on my job description, no one's going to apply because we just don't pay enough. So I want to talk to people. And when they hear about this amazing, brilliant thing that we're trying to do, they're going to want to come work for me. Don't do that to people of color. Do not do it. Don't do it. So yeah, I mean, should you be adequately compensated? You should be adequately compensated, and your lived and your work experience are part of the sum of qualifications that help you do your job well. And so if you work in a nonprofit organization that is not doing enough by way of compensation, I would look at, you have a couple of tools. You always have the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's called BLS. Go to the BLS website. It is ugly. It is not easy to navigate. I'm telling you that right now so that you're not shocked and surprised at how ridiculously ugly and unusable it is. But you can pull salary information on the basis of job titles across any number of fields, and you can filter down to the size of company, revenue. There are lots of different sort of variables. Figure out what you should be paid. Figure out, and then work backwards. I personally am not against mini coups in organization where get your colleagues together and take it upstream to the board of directors. If you really want to go nuclear, you can file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights.
Mm-hmm.
You can file a complaint with the EEOC. Those are the remedies that we have access to. And because we find ourselves in like nice culture, which I personally hate it, there's nothing nice about not getting paid. So
Yep.
use the resources that are available to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and nothing against nonprofits. They're great. They provide value for others, but they still, like, just because it says nonprofit, it's a classification. That doesn't mean that there isn't money for you to be paid. So I think just assuming because it's a nonprofit when you walk in that you need to sacrifice some of your value, what you get paid and what you bring for your compassion.
Yeah,
that makes a nine mad. That makes anybody, I'm sure, really mad. And you know, like you said, it's disadvantaging, very disadvantaging to people who really put in a lot of hard time, hard work, and hard effort that otherwise a lot of people might not. So that's great. That was a great question. Constance made a comment about a great book to shift from passive support to and bystander to a more active ally and active support. It's called The Person You Were Meant to Be. Look at that. And there's the cover. Perfect. Write it down, y'all. Add it to the library. I love it. You know, I think
such a good book. It's such a good book.
Good. I have, you know, all craziness aside in the world right now, I do like that this time has got me back to reading. And God, I read so many good books this last year. We could talk about that the rest of this time, but I don't want to do that. So Florence has a question for you. We have to work with donors and funders to make them understand the need for paid jobs and nonprofits. I don't know. Do we want to go into this one a little bit and unpack it some? It's not really a question, more of a statement, but I don't know if you want to add commentary.
It's like my most favorite topic. Actually, the call that I have right after this one is with a group of people that work as advisors in donor serving organizations, primarily with high net worth individuals. And I tell you people, HNIs are the stingiest human beings on the planet. They are the stingiest people on the planet. And the research, and this is where like data is so useful. The research tells us that people that have significant wealth, 10 million or more a year, the vast majority of them give less than $10,000 a year in like philanthropic giving, which to me is insane. It's like absolute insanity. I'm like, what are you going to do with all that money? Like, how much of it could you possibly? I'm sure they have ways to spend it that you and I don't even know about.
Right.
I sure don't. But yeah, I mean, they're really stingy people, you know. And so I think that where the conversation is shifting in philanthropy is with something called trust-based philanthropy. This is where you give your money with the explicit understanding that community-led organizations, BIPOC-led organizations working in their communities they actually have the answers and the solutions to the problems that are facing their community. So just resource them to solve it. And by the way, I think the same applies to employee resource groups in large companies. Don't give your Black ERG $1,200 budget for the year. Like, don't do it.
Yeah.
Don't do it. Like, that's a slap in the face. Like, you're already asking them to do free work, and then you're saying, "Oh, your budget is $1,200." Like, that's what you spend lunch.
Yeah.
Huh?
That always drove me nuts about ERGs because I tried to start a women's group in my agency before I found Together Digital, and I was they dinged me because one, I got dinged politically, and then I got dinged another time because they're like, "You're spending time on this. Are your client like, is your work getting done?" I was like, "Actually, yeah. Check our success. Check in with them and see how they're thinking." Like, I'm doing all of this, but it seems silly that I should have to facilitate this space. So it's like, oh, you want room at the table, you want equity. Okay, here's your own separate table. It's actually only going to be this big around, and there's your budget. And you have to maintain that table, and you have to provide the content, the food, the nourishment, the education. It's like, why? No, they need,
Yeah, it's like the kids table, you know, where like the kids get people. I had never heard this concept until I moved to America. There's like kid food and adult food. There's like kid cheese. People are, this is kid cheese. And I'm like, what is a kid cheese? Versus like, you know, like don't kid cheese other people. That's all I'm going to say. You know, like we can teach kids to eat exactly the same food as we eat. My mom never had kid cheese, and I think I turned up Okay. So don't do that to other adults. You know, it's really at the end of the day, I think recognizing our privilege and like understanding fundamentally that in all of the areas in our life where we have privilege, we have the biggest blind spots. That point of view is going to serve you well.
Yeah.
And it's not bad to say, oh, I have privilege, right? Like I think Robin DiAngelo's kind of screwed it up for the rest of us by, you know, using the term white privilege and white fragility, because it's not in context. And to make it bad doesn't serve anybody. White privilege, gender privilege, ability privilege, these are all privileges.
Advantage.
For sure, I have ability privilege. Like my house is not ADA compliant. My office is not ADA compliant. You know, like I work out of a heritage building that doesn't have a lift, an elevator, right? And it's because everybody who works in that office can climb stairs right now, right? But tomorrow, if somebody broke their foot or I mean, somebody is in like their last week of pregnancy, that would be a very uncomfortable situation.
Yeah. Absolutely. We had another really good question come in. Any advice on working for people who think they're on this kind of allyship journey, but are actually co-opting this language against, how did you, I always said BIOPC, but you made it a word. What was it?
BIPOC.
BIPOC in a harmful.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So there is a really great handout called the White Supremacy Workplace Culture. Sometimes it's called the White Dominant Workplace Culture, and it has things like perfection and see, I don't even know all the ones on it anymore because I've stopped using it. But a lot of times what I notice is white folks will come upon tools like that and they will use it against people of color. They'll say, you know, perfection is a tool of white supremacy, and why are you pushing me to do something like this, right? Don't you care about creating an anti-racist organization? And my point to that is like, there's no reason for there to be spelling mistakes in a memo.
Yeah.
Like, that's not perfection. That's actually like a really basic expectation that documents are proofread before they make it out into the universe, and certainly before they make it out in front of clients, right? That's not perfectionism. Or like being on time, right? And so yes, like dominant culture has used time against people of color.
Oh, yeah.
My very first job was teaching in West Chicago. It's the hardest I've ever worked as a 21-year-old. And the vast majority of the kids in our school were Latino kids whose parents worked third shift in a factory. And they would be late to school every single day because their parents worked third shift, so they'd get home and then they would take their kids to school, right? So it was a daily occurrence. And so by the time the kids made it in fifth grade, they all had detentions and suspensions because they were late. Don't use it against people of color, right? Like timelines are important. Deadlines are important. Like doing what you said you would do is important. So don't use it out of context and arbitrarily, right? Like that awareness is super important.
Yeah, I think it's just continued education. And like we said earlier, just continuing to speak up, to call out those nuances, just to help help them continue their journey. Use that radical candor.
Yeah.
Use that radical candor as best you can. Therese says she feels very frustrated when applying for jobs, which explicitly states that they invite visible, but mean nothing. It's also a false message that visible minorities, have it easy in the job market.
Teresa, do you want to say more of what you mean? And while you put that in chat, you know, since many of us are like entrepreneurs and startup founders, legally, you cannot say that you want to fill this role with somebody of a certain race, gender, ethnicity, etc.
Yeah.
Legally in the United States is like the only, high income country in the world that makes racial norming illegal,
Right.
which, if you think about it, the DEI goals that organizations set out right now are incompatible with our legal system. How exactly are you going to get up to 30% BIPOC in any part of your organization if you can't specifically hire BIPOC for specific roles, right? And yeah, and yes, it is very frustrating. And often, and this is something that I've noticed big companies lean into more and more, is that they'll say, we highly encourage visible minorities, or we highly encourage BIPOC to apply for a job. And they're doing that. They're doing that because they're following some version of the Rooney Rule. And the Rooney Rule comes out of football, that says if you're going to hire a coach, you need to have a diverse slate of candidates to even like really begin the process. So, it's like some recruiter, some VP, some hiring manager somewhere has a goal or a quota or a target that they need to meet. And that's not followed up with an explicit commitment to actually hire people who are different, for visible minorities. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, it's super tricky. We kind of continuing and going back a little bit to the being a workplace ally, because I think that that's such an important thing right now, especially considering our current living and working standards. I think the thing that you talk about, timeliness, that's super important. I think people don't really, again, that's one of those other things, like when you learn that, you're like, oh, wow, why have I never noticed that before? But again, if you have that privilege, or that's just like your inherent like culture, and it's the dominant culture, you can even take a second thought. But what are some things that we can do to communicate to coworkers who are resistant to creating safety for people who speak on their feelings and experiences in the workplace? So say, somebody feels like timeliness, which I've had direct reports come back to me, and because actually it was more mental health related, actually, but like my boss was coming down on me about their constant tardiness without that context. What are some ways in which we can help, coworkers, whether the direct reports or not, sort of communicate their needs safely in the workplace as allies?
If the amount of nuance that requires is huge. Okay, so since this book has already been recommended, and I have actually read it, I have read this book, and I have met Dolly, and she is the most amazing human being. Awesome. Yeah. So Dolly has this concept, which is, if you work in sort of policy spaces, the 20-60-20 rule. And the 20-60-20 rule is like my bell curve of allyship, right? We typically know who the 20 are that kind of don't give a shit. They might even make our life difficult. Hopefully we also know who the 20 are that are already bought in. We don't have to spend any energy on them. But the 60% in the middle, right? Like they are the ones that are likely to sway. So when I think about advocacy, I really think about where is a person? Are they the 20, 60, or the 20? If they are like in direct opposition, it's not worth it. It is not worth it. You'll get fired. You'll get booted off a cool project. Like, it's not worth it to bring it up to them. The best that you can do in that environment is, go to somebody who can influence them and is like in the forward 20. But you may have to just let it go. If they're in the middle 60, then gentle approaches. It looks like giving and receiving feedback with consent. If I'm on good terms with somebody, I can usually give them feedback and say, hey, Amy, can I talk to you for a minute, right? But if they're in that 60, you might say, hi, do you have a moment? I would really like to talk to you about X, very specific. So assess where somebody is before like moving into advocacy, to save yourself and to save the other person.
That makes a lot of sense. Any other questions for Aparna? There was one other section that I thought was kind of interesting. And I actually see this within the group of women specifically. You had talked about kind of I think it was like the second tip, maybe it was like the pushy and the agenda based sort of motivations.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the way that every one of us communicates is so varied based on our intersectionality. What are some tips that you have to help us start to provide and address feedback, but then give feedback, but then also receive feedback who maybe have a very different tone than we might without, because again, what's the term? I'm at a loss for the term. There's
tone policing.
Yes, thank you. How do we work to avoid that when we're in a workplace? Because we're always in communication. We're always conversing with people. I think it happens a lot.
Yeah, I think that there's a difference between niceness and kindness. And so that's, one of the kind of analogies. That's one of the analogies that I would use here is, are you being nice? Which is superficial. That is a very superficial quality. It doesn't mean anything about what your beliefs are. Or are you kind? And kind can sometimes be hard, because kindness is like addressing a situation often in real time and taking action. So like in Seattle, and like some of you are dialing in from here, the Pacific Northwest, and about kind of like our Seattle freeze culture. So in Seattle, like nice culture reigns supreme, and niceness looks like looking at somebody who's cold and saying, my gosh, like you look cold, wouldn't it be great if you had a hat?
Yeah.
And kindness is, oh, you look cold, here is a hat, can I offer it to you? And there's a big difference, right? And it's the difference between sympathy and empathy. So yeah, honestly, Amy, I don't know that there is like an easy answer to any of these questions. Tone policing is very real. When we get triggered, we get triggered. Yep. And so the conversation that I encourage everybody to have with each other, with their peers, especially in spaces where we're with others that are like us, is really, what are my values? Right? And how am I showing up with those values? And how am I showing up with those values when it's really hard to do so? Right? Like when you see somebody you don't like and they're shivering and you have an extra hat, like, are you going to offer it to them? Yeah. Right? Or are you going to be like, I hope you freeze to DEHA.
Right. No, I mean, that's a great answer. Don't dismiss it at all, because I think it is. You have to always be constantly going back in your process through allyship is also a tremendous amount of self-awareness. And in that, you constantly have to be asking, what is my motivation for this? Why am I choosing this? Am I choosing it to be nice and liked or am I doing it because it's the kind and right thing to do, even if it makes me uncomfortable, even if it means I forego something, even if it means I show up a little more humbly than, what I'm comfortable with. It requires some more vulnerability. So no, I think that's a great answer. And also, how do I show up with my values? I think is great, because I think another thing this translates nicely into is the fact that so many of us are trying to have difficult conversations with people that we love, that our values don't align, you know? And so I think that is just another also great tip. So awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. I know that we saw some conversation between some members about nonprofit. Just know we do have a Slack channel specifically for nonprofits. So if you have some time later this afternoon, hop on over there, have some more conversations, do asks, do gives. If there's anything more that we can help cover on that, let me know. This was so wonderful. Thank you so much for showing up for us and being here today and sharing all of your wisdom and all of these amazing resources. I'm excited to dig into a lot of them and continue learning and continue reading. Thanks for being here.
Awesome. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for taking the time to do this.
All
Awesome.
right.
Happy Friday, everyone. Have a great weekend.